"Ah," said Mr. Oley, "we have heard strange music in our day. I was in York when it was besieged by 3 very notable and great armies, the Scotch, the northern under Lord Fairfax, and the southern under the Earl of Manchester and Oliver. At that time the service at the cathedral every Sunday morning was attended by more than 1,000 ladies, knights and gentlemen, besides soldiers and citizens. When the bombing of cannon broke in upon the singing of the psalms, and more than once a cannon bullet burst into the minster amongst the people, and like a furious fiend or evil spirit, yet no one hurt. After some talk of this nature, we settled ourselves to our music, and to tune our instruments. Mr. Inglesant's violin was inscribed Jacobus Steiner in absam prope Enepontem, 1647. Enepones is the Latin name of Innsbruck in Germany, the chief city of the Tyrol, where this maker lived. As soon as Mr. Inglesant drew his bow across the strings, I was astonished at the full and piercing tone, which seemed to me to exceed even that of the Cremonas. We played a concert or two, with a double bass part for the violin, which had a noble effect, and Mr. Inglesant, being pressed to oblige the company, played a descant upon a ground bass, in the Italian manner. I should fail were I to attempt to describe to you what I felt during the performance of this piece. It seemed to me as though thoughts, which I had long sought and seemed ever and anon on the point of realizing, were at last given me, as I listened to chords of plaintive sweetness, broken now and again by cruel and bitter discords, a theme into which were wrought street and tavern music and people's songs, which lively airs and catches, upon the mere pressure of the string, trembled into pathetic and melancholy cadences. In these dying falls and closes, all the several parts were gathered up and brought together, yet so that what before was joy was now translated into sorrow, and the sorrowful transfigured to peace, as indeed the many shifting scenes of life vary upon the stage of men's affairs. The concert being over, Mr. Dean informed us that it was his intention to attend the afternoon service in the cathedral, and Mr. Inglesant accompanying him, that the physicians departed to visit their patients, and my host and some of the clergy and myself went to the cathedral also, entering rather late. Welcome, I'm Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, and this is The Forge of Tolkien. Pop quiz. Who can identify what I was just reading? Did it sound like Tolkien? What do you think? Well, it wasn't Tolkien, but it was an author, well, according to Holly Ordway, whose book I've just been reading in order to review it, says had an immense effect on Tolkien's style, perhaps even his content. Now, the book that I'm reading, some of you may be familiar with it. I mentioned it in the last video, and I think I was just starting to read it or still thinking about it. It's Tolkien's modern reading, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages. And in it, quite impressively, I was going to call her Professor Ordway, but she's in fact an independent scholar. The book is published by, just a second, I forgot to turn my notifications off. The book is published by Word on Fire, so we're in the sort of appropriate nonfiction context for lovers of Tolkien, scholars, but also, the general public, to understand, well, did Tolkien read any modern literature? Well, of course he did, and, it's sort of funny that, it always feels funny when you get books like this thinking, why in the first place, why do we even have this kind of question? Of course Tolkien must have read modern literature. We know, well, he's friends with the Inklings, they're writing literature in the present, but, confusingly enough, one of those Inklings, C.S. Lewis, once made a sort of throwaway comment about how, he never read anything, later than Chaucer, or maybe it wasn't so much Lewis that made that comment, but Humphrey Carpenter, Tolkien's biographer, attributed to Tolkien opinions that Lewis had about modern literature, or maybe what Ordway shows, which is actually really excellent in the book, is most of what we think about Tolkien having no interest in modern literature is entirely a fiction of his so-called authorized biographer, Humphrey Carpenter, who took some liberties with the way in which he portrayed the good professor, particularly since Carpenter, had grown up in Oxford among the professors and was kind of had a bone to pick. The problem was, again, as Ordway shows, some of what I'm telling you right now I've learned from her. The previous biographers were even worse, and Carpenter at least, I guess, got the approval of the family. He got further approval from the family to edit the letters, which, again, Ordway points out, has even further skewed our appreciation of, say, not just Tolkien's modern reading, but probably, and here I'm very, very interested, obviously, the Catholic and Christian effects on his storytelling and his scholarship. Ordway's point being, we have, thanks to Carpenter, mostly due to Carpenter, this sort of legendary impression that it's a famous famous phrase that he uses and undoes. Okay, sorry. One day I will stop saying that word. I am not sorry. I'm looking for the actual quotation so that I get this correct and that you appreciate the problem. Well, now I can't find it. There's this claim that Tolkien basically took no interest in anything beyond the medieval literature that he was hired to teach as a professor. Well, that's nonsense. And what Ordway finds, and she did this very, very carefully and very, very diligently, references that she can show that Tolkien definitely knew the authors and the books, to 148 different modern authors, and she provides a very helpful chart listing all of them. 148 different authors, some 200 different books, which we know from Tolkien's own references he definitely looked at, read, and so forth. Now, her project is slightly different from a previous book that we talked about, which was, it's down there, Oronza Chili's longer list of sort of every book that he can find reference to in Tolkien scholarship. Ordway is specifically concerned only with the literature, which she counts as sort of poetry, stories. It's a wide range of types of storytelling that she says Tolkien read, published from 1850 to the end of his life, right? And she says it includes variety of different genres: children's stories, historical fiction, fantasy, fantastic romances, adventure, science fiction, detective stories, literary fiction, and poetry. Her purpose being, and this is, I think it's appropriate for part of her intended audience, that she's focusing mainly only on the literature that she can show Tolkien drew upon for The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. She's less concerned with all of the stories that we've been talking about, and focusing simply on the two of Tolkien's published works that most people are familiar with. And in doing so, she's saying these are the books that he used to help fuel his imagination, his creative work in writing The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And that passage that I read to you just now is from one of these so-called romances. It's a book by an author, John Henry Shorthouse, called John Inglesant. And okay, this is ridiculous. Just a second. Pulling up books from my lap and I lost my place. We know for certain that Tolkien read this book and knew about it because he mentions it in one of his letters. And that being Ordway's method, of course we're going to find that he mentions it in his letters, because that's how she figured out what to use in her analysis to say these are what Tolkien read. So it feels a little circular. That's because in her own scholarship, she's only drawing on things that she has citations from Tolkien talking about. And here is the reference that we have for Tolkien's knowledge of Shorthouse's book. He's talking about, it's a letter to Christopher Bretherton from 1964, and Bretherton had asked him various questions about sort of where his stories came from, right? And the letter includes things like the magic ring, the dream of the wave, the great Atlantis story, the names that he drew on Gamgee, and then this curious, fairly long paragraph about a book that, until I read Ordway's book, I had never heard of, even though I have actually read the full volume of the letters, so I clearly had read this letter before. But it's interesting. It's like, which things do you care about in your own reading to figure out what it is that your favorite author read? Well, Ordway went and read everything, and she found this book thanks to this passage. So he's talking about living in Birmingham. I lived for a while in a rather decayed road, aptly called Duchess, in Edgbaston, Birmingham. It ran into a more decayed road called Beaufort. I mention this only because in Beaufort Road was a house, occupied in its palmier days by Mr. Shorthouse, a manufacturer of acids of, I believe, Quaker connections. He, a mere amateur, like myself, with no status in the literary world, suddenly produced a long book, which was queer, exciting, and debatable, or seemed so then. Few now find it possible to read. It was like, I'd never tried reading it. It slowly took on and eventually became a bestseller and the subject of public discussion from the Prime Minister downwards. This was John Inglesant. Mr. Shorthouse became very queer and very un-Brummagem, not to say un-English. He seemed to fancy himself as a reincarnation of some Renaissance Italian and dressed the part. Also his religious opinions, while never leading him to the final lunacy of Romanism, took on a Catholic tincture. I think he never wrote any more, but wasted the rest of his time trying to explain what he had and what he had not meant in John Inglesant. What happened to the carboys of acid, I do not know. I have always tried to take him as a melancholy warning, and still try to attend to my technical carboys and to writing some more. But as you see, I occasionally fall from wisdom. I can't believe I never followed that up, but then I have not, in my own study of Tolkien, been terrifically interested in hunting down all his sources. I mean, even though it's like I say, I'm writing a review of Ordway's book, and I mentioned that I teach this course at the University of Chicago, which the title of it is Tolkien, Medieval and Modern. I've always had the premise, following Tom Shippey's work, particularly Author of the Century, that Tolkien belongs among the great modern authors. Of course he does. He's writing in the 20th century. He's writing as a post-war, both wars, First World War and Second World War author, reflecting on the problems of modernity through his fantasy that, you know, critics from the Guardian, critics from the Guardian like Andrew Rissick sneer at Tom Shippey, for example, for saying that Tolkien's a great modern writer, are showing their own inability to appreciate the moment that we're living in from my perspective, right? I have my continuing sort of joke meme. I wish I need a meme for it. It's a medieval or get the fuck out. Recognizing the degree to which modernity is always defined by its reflection on the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages itself exists as a invention of modernity, as this sort of purposeful contrast that modernity projects as it not itself. The Middle Ages, although, you know, have features and literature that Tolkien read, obviously, that don't seem to belong in modernity, is as much because those who considered themselves modern in the Enlightenment, and so since then, have self-consciously arranged themselves against what they imagine was it's so complicated. And those of you who watched my medieval history series know that my joke, getting medieval on X, Y, or Z, is always this problem of the Middle Ages are what haunts modernity in its own self-perception. Therefore, I am entirely not surprised to find that Tolkien is well, Ordway shows, and C.S. Lewis may not have read the newspaper and purposefully only read literature through the 16th century, but Tolkien subscribed to no fewer than 3 newspapers and was always very, very concerned with events of the day, to the extent, I mean, in literary terms, of, for example, recommending the author of Howard's End and Room with a View, Forster, for the Nobel Prize in Literature. Right? He read modern literature. I don't understand why we don't, and Ordway definitely does this, simply group him with people like James Joyce, and say he was experimenting with language, he was experimenting with story forms, he was, as a Catholic, experimenting with mythology. He's quintessentially modern, and yet my own study of him, even though I've been perfectly well aware of the degree to which he is participating in a commentary on modernity while at the same time delightedly participating in it, right? I think I've mentioned in the past his desire for a typewriter that had Fëanorian script, right? He learned to drive, he had a car. One of his early children's stories about Mr. Bliss in his car driving, right? To imagine that Tolkien was simply anti-modern is nonsensical. And yet his stories always feel themselves, right? Like out of time. So it's a little, frustrating and confusing to find Ordway writing a whole book going through her 148 different authors. Although she says she mentions them all. I mean, I don't feel like I read about 148 different authors. It's an awful lot. With their 200 books, showing passage after passage after passage that really sounds like something in Tolkien. And here he is mentioning how he sees himself paralleled in Shorthouse's own life. I mean, a manufacturer of acids. So he lived in Birmingham. He was a businessman, Quaker, who became Church of England, and in typical Tolkienian fashion here, the final lunacy of Romanism. Tolkien was, of course, Catholic, and one of the best things about Ordway's commentary on Tolkien is saying, you have to hear that Tolkien's English, and Americans listening to English rhetoric of the sort of self-reflective sort that Tolkien is often using, usually miss the point. I do have the good fortune to have spent some years in England, and have friends and Milo who are English, and I get what she's describing in this, that they will. There's a lovely way she sets it. She's talking about Tolkien's habit of hyperbole, and self-deprecation and understatement, and saying it's helpful in interpreting Tolkien's various statements about his sources, influences, reading preferences, and creative process to realize that he is often hyperbolic in what he denies or rejects, but modest and ironic in what he affirms or claims. We also should keep in mind that he was so deeply read in his professional specialty of philology that he would have been predisposed to view his reading in other areas as genuinely limited by comparison. And the example that she adverts to several times is what he says in On Fairy Stories about how he's never really he hasn't read very much on it. It's like, yeah, right. That I tell you, it helps to have been a graduate student in Cambridge for several years and been, subjected to this kind of English understatement when people would say, "Oh, I don't know very much about that." And it's like they're the world expert in the field. Whereas, or in opposite terms, as in this letter where he's saying, the lunacy of Romanism, right? When Tolkien will say things like, "Oh, so and so is never to be read. For example, like Dorothy Sayers, I did want, in reading Ordway's book, to find out that she just, hunted out another reference to Dorothy Sayers. Alas, she hadn't. That the one we have seems to be in the letters where he says, Tolkien, he says he liked the Peter Wimsey stories up to Gaudy Night, and Busman's Honeymoon was just unreadable. And apparently he thought she was a bit vulgar in the play that I read from, the man who born to be king. So I'm not even sure with that, right? It's like saying he didn't like Peter Wimsey in those last novels and found them unreadable. At what point do you take Tolkien seriously? For example, with his comments on C.S. Lewis and the Narnia stories, how much he disliked them. Well, maybe it was his, English hyperbole rather than an actual in-depth, recognition of his appreciation for the stories. I refer you to Ordway's book for lots of details on all of these things, saying understanding the degree to which Tolkien admitted he drew on other sources than the ones that he's even mentioned in his letters or referenced them. Well, this book has been, Ordway's book has been quite the journey. And Shorthouse is this interesting problem, saying what's interesting about Shorthouse and the things that Tolkien mentions, that he was Quaker, that his book was originally privately published, only about 100 copies were printed just for his friends, and then it was reprinted many times to the extent that it sold something like 80,000 copies, which is enormous. So much so that it was the subject, as Tolkien says, of popular discussion. It's set in the English Civil War, and much of it takes place in Italy. I have not read this book. I did find an interesting review of it in the Saturday Review from 1881, which, if you're curious, gives a fairly long summary of it. But it was disguised as memoirs of the life of Mr. John Inglesant, sometimes servant to King Charles I, with an account of his birth, education, and training by the Jesuits, and a particular relation of the secret services in which he was engaged, especially in connection with the late Irish Rebellion, and with several other remarkable passages and occurrences. Also a history of his religious doubts and experiences, and the Molinist or Quietist in Italy, in which country he resided for many years, with an account of the election of the late Pope and many other events and affairs. And as this is the Saturday Review from July 9th, 1881. And the reviewer explains that the book professes to be the mere collection of a series of papers relating to the life of royalists during the stirring times of the Civil Wars in the Commonwealth. It's not a novel in any proper sense. Mr. Shorthouse calls it a romance, perhaps in remembrance of Hawthorne, with whom it was a favorite title. Okay, so it's a historical fiction, an epistolary novel, as we would say. And the passage that I read to you at the beginning of this episode comes from the end of the book, chapter 39, which is a letter purporting to describe this little concert that the author, Valentine Lee, I believe, attended, where Mr. Inglesant, the main character, was playing the violin. Right? So what it is, and I get this from the review rather than the book, which is 400 pages long, and I'm looking for a printed copy of it. You can find it out there in Google Books and things like that quite easily, but I'd like to read it in print rather than paper, on screen. The reviewer comments that it's not actually terrifically well written as a book. It can claim but very little on the score of construction, as we commonly understand construction in a novel. The plot of the whole latter half drags, and is hindered and confused by episodes, some of them interesting, others pointless and tedious. The turning point of this part, the moment when Inglesant first gains direct information of the murder of Malvolti, is slurred over in seamlessly careless and ineffective manner. It's not great literature, and it's not a great sort of adventure story. It's not Dumas like The Three Musketeers, or even Victor Hugo like Les Miserables. It's long essays on religion, which therefore makes me interested in reading it. But it's there's obviously a variety of things that could be very interesting about John Ingalls, the John Inglesant, other than that Tolkien clearly knew about it and worried that he was, like Inglesant, having sort of given himself this exercise of writing this unreadable novel. 1964 is just on the cusp of when Lord of the Rings really takes off as a popular book. And that he should have, continuing theme for Tolkien, should have spent more of his time in his actual professional work. And yet there's that passage. As I listen to chords of plaintive sweetness broken now and again by cruel and bitter discords. Chords broken by discord. That sounds a little familiar. A theme into which, themes broken by discord, were wrought street and tavern music and people songs. All of the different mixtures of styles that we've been talking about in Tolkien stories. 3 themes in the music of creation disrupted by discord, which lively airs and catches upon the mirror pressure of the string, trembled into pathetic and melancholy cadences. In these dying falls and closes, all the several parts were gathered up and brought together. It's so that what before was joy was now translated into sorrow, and the sorrowful transfigured to peace, as indeed the many shifting scenes of life vary upon the stage of men's affairs. There's a passage, isn't there? It sounds a little like that. And when the glad shout had swelled up and died away again to Sam's final and complete satisfaction and pure joy, a minstrel of Gondor stood forth and knelt and begged leave to sing. And behold, he said, Lo, lords and knights and men of valor unashamed, kings and princes and fair people of Gondor, and riders of Rohan, and ye sons of Elrond and Dunedain of the north, and elf and dwarf and great hearts of the Shire, and all free folk of the west, now listen to my lay. For I will sing to you Frodo of the Nine Fingers and the Ring of Doom. And when Sam heard that, he laughed aloud for sheer delight, and stood up and cried, Oh, great glory and splendor, and all my wishes have come true. And then he wept. And all the host laughed and wept, and in the midst of their merriment and tears the clear voice of the minstrel rose like silver and gold, and all men were hushed. And he sang to them, now in the elven tongue, now in the speech of the west, until their hearts, wounded with sweet words, overflowed, and their joy was like swords, and they passed in thought out to regions where pain and delight flow together, and tears are the very wine of blessedness. I've never before in my life been able to read that without weeping, and I just did, because I am horrified by Ordway's suggestion that Tolkien got that from Inglesant. In these dying falls and closes, all the several parts were gathered up and brought together, yet so that what before was joy was now translated into sorrow, and the sorrowful transferred figured to peace, as indeed the many shifting scenes of life vary upon the stage of men's affairs. I feel a bit sick, actually, and this was going to be the tenor of my review. What do you do when you find out that literally your favorite passage in your favorite book isn't original to your favorite author? Now, it's a funny thing, right? It's a funny thing because one of the things that we know about Tolkien is that he studied stories, right? That he gave a great lecture about fairy stories and talked in this lecture about how stories come from this whole repertoire of previous stories, that the soup that we're eating in the story that we're reading at the moment is composed of multiple different ingredients, and that it's not, should we delight in that? Should we feel sick? I'm not kidding. I feel sick realizing that joy like swords transfigured into the very wine of blessed. They blend now. Shorthouse and Tolkien in that passage, and it doesn't really help to find out. I said that Ordway was mainly concerned with the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, but consider, I'll read this again, and I'm going to make you feel just as sick as I do. Listen. As I listened to chords of plaintive sweetness, broken now and again by cruel and bitter discords, theme into which were wrought street and tavern music and people's songs, which lively airs and catches upon the mere pressure of the string, trembled into pathetic and melancholy cadences. In these dying falls and closes, all the several parts were gathered up and brought together. Yet so that what before was joy was now translated into sorrow, and the sorrowful transfigured to peace, as indeed the many shifting scenes of life vary upon the stage of men's affairs. And now my favorite passage from the Ainulindale. Then again Iluvatar arose, and the Einar perceived that his countenance was stern, and he lifted up his right hand. Behold, a third theme grew amid the confusion, and it was unlike the others. For it seemed at first soft and sweet, a mere rippling of gentle sounds and delicate melodies. But it could not be quenched, and it took to itself power and profundity. And it seemed at last that there were two musics progressing at one time before the seat of Iluvatar, and they were utterly at variance. One was deep and wide and beautiful, but slow and blended with an immeasurable sorrow, from which its beauty chiefly came. The other had now achieved a unity of its own, but it was loud and vain and endlessly repeated, and it had little harmony, but rather a clamorous unison as of many trumpets braying upon a few notes. And it essayed to drown the other music by the violence of its voice, but it seemed that its most triumphant notes were taken by the other and woven into its own solemn pattern. Now, it's true that, it's like you're having to hang the association, the referencing, the illusion on joy and sorrow and blending and theme and discord and chords and so forth like that. But is Ordway wrong? Is it not there? We know that Tolkien read Shorthouse. We know that he thought of him as the book. Queer. If you read The Lord of the Rings very carefully, you know that the hobbits in the Shire at the opening talk constantly about things being queer. Queer is not an idle adjective for Tolkien to use. It's the adjective that points him to adventure, possibility. All of those hobbits that stay in the Shire and talk about Ents, or they don't know, walking trees possibly. Queer things going on outside of the Shire. Queer is a good thing as far as Tolkien is concerned, because it's un-Brummagem, un-English. It takes you out of the Shire. Exciting! Queer, exciting, and debatable. We want debate. We want to have the problem of the truth of the story that we're working within. Tolkien took on, one of the reasons that he ends up in the arguments that he does over the syllabus, which is when he famously, says things about, now I'm not even sure that he actually said it. It's like the Apocrypha are floating around, whether he said there was no literature after Chaucer. That may have been Lewis. Double check it in Ordway. I've been studying these tropes for so long that Ordway's a great caution. It's like, wait, do I believe that? I never believed that Tolkien was only a medieval reader, but now I'm not sure which bits he said and which bits are just Carpenter's imagining. Queer, exciting, and debatable. We read the Notion Club papers. We talked about how Tolkien read science fiction. We know that he read Voyage to Arcturus, which I had not appreciated properly how weird it was until I read Ordway's account of it. It's like, you think John Inglesant is not widely read now. Voyage to Arcturus wasn't even read at the time when it came out. It's so bizarre. Although it does have a blue sun and two new primary colors, so we may need to go there and look at the colors. To point to these allusions and references and to think they actually are there. They are. I'm I don't think Ordway's wrong in this, but I'm really wrestling. I'm struggling with the idea that Tolkien was derivative. No, I mean, and it is he? Isn't he? I mean, it's like, I told you the story of John Inglesant. It's not at all the plot of The Lord of the Rings, although plot has an interesting way of showing up in places that you don't always expect, and you sort of recognizing the degree to which a story clothed in one kind of atmosphere may actually be the plot that you're familiar with from another context. It's like The Matrix, right? That you're delighted to find that the mystery, the plot is enfolding itself in all of the stories that have come before. Oh, well, this sounds actually more delightful, right? That we think about the way Tolkien described fairy stories and this, this participation in the soup of stories, so that, for example, saying, well, the history of stories, the soup of stories thing he gets from somebody else. That's not his metaphor, which is interesting. It's Dasent, whom I realize I don't know who is, but who cares? Scholars care, and we're going to have to do all the footnotes, right? In Dasent's words, I would say, we must be satisfied with the soup that is set before us and not desire to see the bones of the ox out of which it has been boiled. Though oddly enough, end quote, though oddly enough, Dasent by the soup meant a mishmash of bogus prehistory founded on the early surmises of comparative philology, and by desire to see the bones, he meant a demand to see the workings and the proofs that led to these stories. By the soup, I mean the story as it is served up by its author or teller, and by the bones its sources or material, even when by rare luck these can be certainly discovered. But I do not, of course, forbid criticism of the soup as soup. This is it from his lecture on fairy stories, his Andrew Lang lecture on fairies. Oh, look, I have some Andrew Lang. We might be reading a little bit of it in a second, right? So he's saying, if we think about the problem of understanding literature, you have the story as it is in front of you at the moment, the poem, the adventure story, the quest, the detective story, right? And the bones, its sources or material. And he's saying, as scholars, and this is, the sort of scholarly problem is always, we want to get at, well, what, right? And this is, I know Ordway means to do homage to Tolkien with her study, and I appreciate that, and I respect her for the scholarly exercise of looking for his sources and showing, look, Humphrey Carpenter misrepresented our author for us. Tolkien was very much engaged with commenting on modernity in modern literature. I appreciate Ordway's desire to do that, and her commitment to hunting down and reading everything. I mean, she clearly read John Inglesant to find basically, there's a theme of pity, which is interesting. That, one of the things that happens in the course of the story is Inglesant's having to forgive Malvolti, which is that review that I read referenced it. And Ordway argues that this theme of pity that becomes absolutely central to The Lord of the Rings, it's like the reason that Gollum is there to bite the ring off of Frodo's finger so that, it will be destroyed in the volcano, is because Bilbo and then Frodo took pity on Gollum, and that, and in fact, saves him. Like, pity as a theme. If in fact Tolkien got that from reading Inglesant and finding it queer and exciting and debatable, that's a really significant contribution to our appreciation of how Tolkien wrote. But to recognize, to be able to, that Ordway knows Tolkien so well, to read 400 pages of it and find that one passage that I've read for you and recognize it as an echo of the scene from the Field of Cromalin. Are we tasting the soup? Does this help us appreciate the Lord of the Rings better? Or does it mean just fills it up with gristle and bones? Well, Tolkien as a scholar obviously had as part of his, life purpose looking for these kinds of backstories, right? And later on Fairy Stories, he talks about, an example. Speaking of the history of stories, and especially fairy stories, we may say that the pot of soup, the cauldron of story, has always been boiling, and to it have continually been added new bits, dainty and undainty. For this reason, to take a casual example, that's a Tolkien, English Tolkienism, right? Casual, right? Like he thought that one through, right? That this example he's going to give you. The fact that a story resembling the one known as the Goose Girl, Das Gasenmagd in Grimm, is told in the 13th century of Bertha Broadfoot, mother of Charlemagne. So it's told in the 13th century of the mother of Charlemagne, who lived in the 8th and 9th century. He's crowned at 800, so he lives in the 8th and 9th century. Mother of Charlemagne really proves nothing either way. Neither that the story was in the 13th century descending from Olympus or Asgard by way of an already legendary king of old on its way to become a house marchen, fairy tale, right? Nor that it was on its way up. The story is found to be widespread, unattached to the mother of Charlemagne or to any historical character. From this fact by itself, we certainly cannot deduce that it is not true of Charlemagne's mother, though that is the kind of deduction that is most frequently made from that kind of evidence. The opinion that the story is not true of Bertha Broadfoot must be founded on something else, on features in the story which the critic's philosophy does not allow to be possible in real life, so that you would actually disbelieve the tale, even if it were found nowhere else, or on the existence of good historical evidence that Bertha's actual life was quite different, so he would disbelieve the tale, even if his philosophy allowed that it was perfectly possible in real life. That is the kind of sort of source hunting that folklorists got into, particularly in Tolkien's lifetime, there's only one scholar, a very prominent scholar right now in medieval studies, Jan Ziolkowski, who's a professor at Harvard, who really studies the history of these kinds of fairy tales. He did an excellent book on fairy tales before fairy tales. I think that's the title. And he's also done like a 6-volume study of one Marian miracle, the Tumbler, the Juggler of Notre Dame, in which he shows some of the kinds of things that I've been talking about right now, with the way in which the medieval and the modern are symbiotic, right? That this medieval story of the Tumbler is very, very important from 1881, actually the same year that Inglesant came out, for the construction of modernity in the early 20th century, including things like, the Gothic architecture on college campuses, right? So we're interested, obviously, as scholars, in finding the sources for our stories, the long history of how the story comes to be. And yet there's always a danger, I think a very great danger in destroying the magic, which one reviewer of Tolkien's Smith of Wootton Major called it cutting open the ball to discover its bounce, right? If you take the story, something like Smith of Wootton Major, fairy story, The Lord of the Rings, and cut it open to start, figuring out where the ball came from, you have no ball anymore and no bounce. You have this inanimate dead thing rather than the joyous plaything that you would have had. And the further irony of doing this at all with Tolkien, and that's where the soup reference, when he's saying, there's nothing wrong with I do not forbid criticism of the soup as soup. Soup in this sense being the story as told. That is, of course, the thing for which he is most famous in his study of Beowulf, and in the lecture that he gave on the Beowulf in 1936, called The Monsters and the Critics, in which he makes another great metaphor. The soup of stories is one that Tolkien's really famous for. It's like when we're eating the soup, are we worrying about where the flavoring comes from? Or are we enjoying the soup itself? In the Beowulf lecture, he gives us another great image of the tower. And in this, the tower image is coming, it's allegory number 2 of 4 that he sets up for criticizing the scholarship on Beowulf, of which, again, in typical Tolkien fashion, he says, I fear that unworthy successor and beneficiary of Joseph Bosworth, I have not been a man so diligent in my special walk, in his study of Beowulf, as duly to read all that has been printed on or touching on this poem. But I read enough. It's like, for goodness sake, right? He read extensively on Beowulf, which he then goes on to prove by making fun of it, to point out that almost everything, literally what he's saying, almost everything, I've read enough, I think, to venture the opinion that Beowulfiana, great word, Beowulfiana, is, while rich in many departments, specially poor in one. If you're making a claim of lack, you do it only on the basis of being pretty confident that you've read around the field fairly significantly. And he's saying that the study of Beowulf in 1936 was poor in one factor in particular. It is poor in criticism that is directed to the understanding of a poem as a poem. Soup as soup, right? It's like, we're not reading it as a poem. It has been said of Beowulf itself that its weakness lies in placing the unimportant things at the center and the important on the outer edges. That is one of the opinions I wish specially to consider. I think it profoundly untrue of the poem, but strikingly true of the literature about it. You've got to get into his, he is eviscerating his colleagues. Debatable. He's eviscerating his colleagues by saying, you're not talking about the central thing. All of the scholarship is about the periphery of Beowulf. Beowulf, the poem, has been used as a quarry of fact and fancy far more assiduously than it has been studied as a work of art. I mean, and what's interesting about this, thanks to Tolkien's lecture, then people started reading Beowulf as a work of art. And this is where I sort of stumble and go, really? I mean, everybody says this about Tolkien's lecture. Is it true that before the Beowulf lecture, before the 1936 Beowulf lecture, people hadn't been reading Beowulf as an actual work of art, as literature? And, those of my friends in the field tend to say yes, that is true, that Tolkien's essay really, his lecture, published as an essay, really did have this transformative effect on the scholarly conversation, making it out that when you're studying this great poem of, Old English, we still haven't, I think, done it as fully with all of the other English poems, but then that's not my field, so I don't know. I tend to just read them as poems, and I don't know what else everybody's saying about them, so, I'm kind of in the reverse position. Prior to Tolkien, nobody, like he's saying, it's especially poor in actually talking about the poem as a poem. Ergo, what he's saying is, what most people had been doing with Beowulf was looking in it for hints and sources of things that it could show you about something other than its own work. And this is where this very famous allegory came in. So I would express the whole industry in yet another allegory. Again, Tolkien actually loved allegory. Pache, his hyperbolic statement that he much prefers history to allegory, he thinks symbolically constantly. And there is that's a nice tidbit that I get from Ordway, where she's talking about, now what do we learn from reading about Tolkien's own appreciation of reading. And one of the things she says is this is what this what I think a rather ugly picture is about. It's a print from The Fur-Topped Hearst by Sir William Russell Flint from Matthew Arnold's The Scholar, Gypsy, and Thyrsis, 1910, and that Tolkien actually owned this print, or owned this landscape, right? And Ordway says, look at it and you see his drawings of Hobbiton, definitely, right? And there's a kind of agricultural implement there. What is a haywain? A mower? Farming implement. She doesn't say what it is. And the hill with the tree on top far away, and this. So he's very inspired visually, and Ordway notes, it's also worth noting that in his own work, both literary and visual, Tolkien was fascinated by symbols, as his daughter-in-law Bailey explained, quote, from the very beginning he explored the interrelationship of words, pictures, and symbols. Perceptively, she notes, quote, a deceptive combination of naturalism and formality in his visual art, and suggests these varied elements need to be interpreted, quote, to be interpreted for an understanding of his imagination, many-faceted and extraordinarily unified. I'm glad to have that in my Tolkien repertoire now. It's like he thought in words, pictures, and symbols, which makes sense. That's what we've been seeing him doing. So when he says he doesn't like allegory, I think he just doesn't like heavy-handed symbolism. He loves symbolism, and that he puts it, that some of his best arguments are in fact put in allegory is worth noting. I mean, in fact, all of his best arguments are in story or allegory. They're picture rhetoric, right? Well, here we have the allegory of the tower. I would express the whole industry in yet another allegory. A man inherited a field in which was an accumulation of old stone, part of an older hall. Of the old stone, some had already been used in building the house in which he actually lived, not far from the old house of his fathers. Of the rest, he took some and built a tower. But his friends coming perceived at once, without troubling to climb the steps, that these stones had formerly belonged to a more ancient building. So they pushed the tower over with no little labor, in order to look for hidden carvings and inscriptions, or to discover whence the man's distant forefathers had obtained their building material. Some, suspecting a deposit of coal under the soil, began to dig for it, and forgot even the stones. They all said, "This tower is most interesting." But they also said, after pushing it over, "What a muddle it is in." And even the man's own descendants, who might have been expected to consider what he had been about, were heard to murmur, "He is such an odd fellow. Imagine his using these old stones just to build a nonsensical tower. Why did he not restore the old house? He had no sense of proportion." But from the top of that tower, the man had been able to look out upon the sea. So he says, here's our allegory. There's a field with stones in it, and the stones had been previously used to build another building. Some of this older stone had been used to build the house that he was actually living in, but there was other stones left over that he wanted to build a tower that his friends came along and looked at and said, well, this is just nonsense. There's what we're actually interested in is the more ancient building that these stones were originally part of. And so they pushed down the tower and looked at the older stones for hints of where they came from, right? Which would be, we're going to take the Lord of the Rings. Right, we'll take the Lord of the Rings, push it over, read through Tolkien's letters and his lectures and all of his other publications, and figure out where he got all his bits from. And then what? And what then do we understand? Well, Ordway explains that what she thinks we understand now is this sort of alchemical process of creativity. And like I said, she is very respectful and did this to honor Tolkien, to rescue him as it were, from the claim that he didn't know modern literature. But, the bizarre thing, and this is a sort of cautionary tale of, well, how do you do scholarship? The bizarre thing is, having done it, and now, having this multi-page, how long is it? 295. 10-page chart showing you all the other books that he read, and, spending near 300 pages going through and finding the passages where, oh, look, he got the idea to do the rewriting of the nursery rhymes from Puss Cat Mew, and he got the idea for his dragon stories from not just Beowulf, but also from, for example, Andrew Lang's The Yellow Fairy Book, where we have a story about the Dragon of the North, which includes, oh my goodness, a tradition. This is in Andrew Lang. A tradition amongst the wise men of the country that the dragon might be overcome by one who possessed King Solomon's signet ring, upon which secret writing was engraved. Right. Right, so we have the Yellow Fairy Book. This one of the 12 color fairy books. Tolkien, in the lecture on fairy stories, is very explicit about drawing on Lang. Obviously, he'd grown up reading Lang's stories. They come out over the course of his childhood. The Ordway has a good discussion of his reading of Lang. And it was actually Lang and his wife, Leonora Blanche Lang, who helped edit the books, although they only have his name on the title pages. But they're 12 colors: blue, red, green, yellow, pink, gray, violet, crimson, brown, orange, olive, and lilac. The blue one coming out in 1889, and the lilac coming out in 1910. So they're actually coming out. Tolkien's born in 1893, so they're literally the most current children's literature as he's growing up. And he, on fairy stories, is in fact the lecture, for the Andrew Lang, in honor of Andrew Lang, right? So not only did Tolkien grow up reading the fairy stories, but he gives the lecture in honor of Lang, saying the number of collection of fairy stories is now very great. In English, none probably rival either the popularity or the inclusiveness or the general merits of the 12 books of 12 colors, which we owe to Andrew Lang and his wife. Tolkien acknowledges Lang's wife, even though the books don't. The first of these appeared more than 50 years ago, 1889, and is still in print. Most of its contents pass the test more or less clearly. I will not analyze them, though an analysis might be interesting. Okay, so he talks about the lecture on fairy stories is dedicated to Lang, and we know that Tolkien used these stories, but what do we do, having pushed over the tower of Tolkien's oeuvre, to find that the idea of a ring with secret writing on it that could defeat the dragon is right there in the Yellow Fairy Book, right? Yep. 1894, so it came out the year after Tolkien was born. And in the story, it's the young man gets the help of a magician to find the ring. The ring is in fact in the possession of a beautiful maiden who one day shows it to him. He lives with her for a time. One day the maiden took him into a secret chamber where a little gold box was standing on a silver table. Silver and gold. Pointing to the box, she said, "Here is my greatest treasure, whose like is not to be found in the whole world. 'Tis a precious gold ring." Joy, sorrow, precious. I mean, his vocabulary is in all of these books. What do we do with that? Is this knocking the tower over and finding the inscriptions and losing the tower, losing the soup in favor of bones? Or is this Kellenforschung the source hunting appreciation of Tolkien's creative process. When you marry me, I will give you this ring as a marriage gift, and it will make you the happiest of mortal men. But in order that our love may last forever, you must give me the ring for the ring 3 drops of blood from the little finger of your left hand. When the youth heard these words, a cold shudder ran over him, for he remembered that his soul was at stake. That's a terrible ring, right? He was cunning enough, however, to conceal his feelings and to make no direct answer, but he only asked the maiden, as if carelessly, what was remarkable about the ring. You want to know, right? You want what? Okay, this is a magic ring that comes with inscriptions. Well, if you read the further along in the story, he does manage to he tricks the dragon into swallowing this iron horse. There's a king's daughter that he gets it complicated, right? But we want the power of this precious gold ring. She answered, no mortal is able entirely to understand the power of this ring, because no one thoroughly understands the secret signs engraved upon it. Ooh, secret signs. But even with my half knowledge, I can work great wonders. Remember, one of the interesting things in The Hobbit, he finds a ring. It's one of magic rings, right? Clearly, Tolkien's writing The Hobbit as a children's story. Children's stories that he remembers having read growing up had magic rings in them. The Hobbit gets a ring, right? And this is one of the magic rings. That its powers are mysterious and undefined. Seems to fit as well. If I put the ring upon the little finger of my left hand, I can fly like a bird through the air wherever I wish to go. If I put it on the third finger of my left hand, I am invisible. I felt bad about Inglesant and the music. Come on, you guys can cope with this. And I can see everything that passes around me, though no one can see me. If I put the ring upon the middle finger of my left hand, then neither fire nor water nor any sharp weapon can hurt me. If I put it on the forefinger of my left hand, then I can, with its help, produce whatever I wish. I can in a single moment build houses or anything I desire. I think Bilbo got a bad ring, right? All it could do was turn him invisible. Finally, as long as I wear the ring on the thumb of my left hand, that hand is so strong that it can break down rocks and walls. Besides these, the ring has other secret signs which, as I said, no one can understand. No doubt it contains secrets of great importance. The ring formerly belonged to King Solomon, the wisest of kings, during whose reign the wisest men lived. But it is not known whether this ring was ever made by mortal hands. It is supposed that an angel gave it to the wise king. Well, that is a pretty cool ring, right? And you can say, now we find that there are passages that Tolkien drew upon for sort of atmosphere. We can say, Ordway talks about, she gives a nice quotation from Lewis, thinking about the difference between sources and influences, that a source gives us the things to write about, characters, plots, themes, images, but quote, an influence prompts us to write in a certain way, so style or form. And you can see just between these, remember, Ordway goes through 148 different authors, 200 different books, showing all of these places that Tolkien is picking up both characters, plots, themes, images, and ways of writing, right? Style. It's interesting that in in this one, The Dragon of the North, we have the ring belonging to King Solomon, because another of the great authors that we know Tolkien liked and read was Rider Haggard. King Solomon's Mines. Tolkien likes Rider Haggard because, as I mentioned in the last video, Haggard is writing about stories of lost cities found in Africa, right? And I think the title King Solomon's Mines is better than the story itself, but the premise being that King Solomon of the Old Testament, the wise king, I mean, one, he gets visited by the Queen of Sheba, who comes to see him and is marveling at all of his great wisdom, but he has an afterlife throughout European history as the one to whom all of this magic is attributed, right? That if you remember back to episode on magic words, I was talking about Honorius of the Sworn Book of Honorius, right? That the Seal of Solomon is this great magical device. So anything in the fairy story, that one's actually from Estonia, apparently. That anything that is invoking Solomon, yes, from Estonia, has this biblical sort of scriptural cachet. So there's in the Lang story, an angel possibly gave King Solomon this ring, and we can't read all its inscriptions, and there's greater knowledge and mystery hidden in these magical objects that we can't yet decipher. If it's King Solomon, it's probably in Hebrew too, right? So consider how much Tolkien's love of fancy alphabets and such is scriptural as well. What I'm trying to demonstrate for you is this this sort of stacks of books that you need to do what I do, which is talk through how to make the soup, right? How I'm pulling in all of these different elements and hints and references and allusions, and what I'm wondering as you're listening is, are you delighted or are you horrified? It's like, is this pleasurable to say, yes. I mean, one of the great pleasures can be there's more books to read, right? That if Tolkien liked it, maybe I'll like it too, and that will give me more literature to read. But it's kind of funny, right? Because on the one hand, yes, there are stories out there that Tolkien enjoyed. I have some of the other ones here. Lord Dunsany, and this is King of Elfland's daughter. It's like I had to go pull books off my shelves to say, okay, what else do I have? He very much liked E. Nesbit. This one's The Phoenix and the Carpet, right? These adventure stories for kids. And he was very influenced by George MacDonald. More the Princess and the Curdie stories, although MacDonald wrote lots and lots of stories, and I just don't have a lot of them. But you can say, all right, this is fun, right? Finding out that there are more stories that might have the same atmosphere, might have the same air as Tolkien, should give us joy to say, we seem to like it now, when I can say the more I read in this, the more I realize John C. Wright has done his homework, right? Because a lot of the elements that are in the Moth and Cobweb stories, the ones of his I've read, are coming from this expanded repertoire of Tolkieniana, not just Tolkien and not just even the history of Middle-earth, right? But of the other stories that Tolkien himself was drawing on. For example, with that ring, right? The ring and the Dragon of the North. One of the interesting things in the Dark Avenger's sidekick is she has a magic ring that, if she can figure out how to position correctly, gives her lots of different kinds of powers, whether flying or, becoming invisible, or, John C. Wright, you need to come talk to me. Is it delightful to realize that there are those associations and references and repertoires and allusions, or is it frustrating to think, wait, my favorite author isn't as literally original. He's not creating out of nothing to the degree that I thought he was. For example, this is from She, as in She Who Must Be Obeyed. This is the moment when the main characters, the adventurers, first see her. It's Holly and I is the narrator, and I've lost track of Rand. She is Leo Venci is the main character, but he's the narrator. It's first person narrator, and he's traveling with his guardian Horace Holly, and they come to this hidden kingdom in Africa and discover the queen, who is now going to unveil. Say, wilt thou see? I will, I answered, my curiosity overpowering me. She lifted her white and rounded arms. Never had I seen such arms before, and slowly, very slowly, she withdrew some fastening behind her hair. Then of a sudden the long corpse-like wrappings fell from her to the ground, and my eyes traveled up her form, now robed only in a garb of clinging white, that did but serve to show its rich and imperial shape, instinct with a life that was more than life, and with a certain serpent-like grace which was more than human. On her little feet were sandals fastened with studs of gold. Then came ankles more perfect than ever sculptor dreamed of. About the waist her white kirtle was fastened by a double-headed snake of solid gold, above which her gracious form swelled up in lines as pure as they were lovely, till the kirtle ended at the snowy argent of her breast, whereon her arms were folded. I gazed above them at her face, and I do not romance, shrank back blinded and amazed. I have heard of the beauty of celestial beings, now I saw it. Only this beauty, with all its awful loveliness and purity, was evil, or rather, at the time, it impressed me as evil. She is evil. Aisha killed her previous lover and is hoping that Leo, the narrator, is his reincarnation. It's complicated. And, okay, keep going. How am I to describe it? I cannot. Simply, I cannot. The man does not live whose pen could convey a sense of what I saw. The indescribability topos is a trope. I might talk of the great changing eyes of deepest, softest black, of the tinted face, of the broad and noble brow, on which the hair grew low and delicate straight features. But beautiful, surpassingly beautiful, as were all these, her loveliness did not lie in them. It lay rather, if it can be said to have had any abiding home, in a visible majesty, in an imperial grace, in a godlike stamp of softened power, which shone upon that radiant countenance like a living halo. Never before had I guessed what beauty made sublime could be, and yet the sublimity was a dark one. The glory was not all of heaven, but nonetheless it was glorious. Though the face before me was that of a young woman, of certainly not more than 30 years, in perfect health in the first flush of ripened beauty, yet it bore stamped upon it a seal of unutterable experience, and of deep acquaintance with grief and passion. Not even the slow smile that crept about the dimples of her mouth could hide this shadow of sin and sorrow. It shone even in the light of those glorious eyes. It was present in the air of majesty, and it seemed to say, "Behold me, lovely as no woman was or is, undying and half divine. Memory haunts me from age to age, and passion leads me by the hand. Evil have I done, and with sorrow have I made acquaintance from age to age. And from age to age evil I shall do, and sorrow shall I know till my redemption comes." I think there's our white lady. Oh dear. I mentioned in the last episode that I was a little disturbed by realizing this, because I had read She. I mean, I'm pulling things off my shelf that I have read in the past, and so, enjoying a similar sort of repertoire of stories that Tolkien clearly drew upon as well. I should have figured out that Galadriel was modeled on Aisha, not only, as Tolkien insists in the letter where he's trying to be, deferential to his Catholic friend, the Virgin Mary, right? Now, Rider Haggard, also businessman, interestingly, it's these amateur storytellers that Tolkien is most taken with. Inglesant, Shorthouse writing Inglesant, and Haggard, and a few others that like Lang and Morris are the ones that Ordway says Tolkien, one, admitted that he drew on most, and clearly does seem to share themes with, and scenes and hints of landscape and images. Morris is very important for the Dead Marshes, and also for certain turns of phrase, like a midmost. A midmost, if you find it in a midmost, it's a Morrisonian influence. That Aisha, the point of her is that she's thousands of years old, and she wants Leo Vinci to, recognize himself as her reincarnate lover, and to bathe in the fountain that will keep them both young. But when she does it, it backfires, and she shrivels up, and shows her age. So I wonder who else may have used that trope in a recent movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Right. So you start reading all of this, and are you delighted by it and recognizing more of Tolkien's process? Or are you horrified in thinking, well, all right, this is all very well and good to say we're, digging down in the leaf mulch, the image that Ordway uses to discover the soil out of which, I mean, his reading is his soil, right? The other stories are the soil out of which his stories grow. Are we delighted to find that he was in conversation with these other authors, or are we disappointed? Well, what if he was even more influenced by Lewis than I had previously appreciated? Famously, as Ordway points out, maybe we can't really push this as hard as we think we should. He didn't like the Narnia series, except that he gave his grandchildren had access to them, so maybe he did actually like them. What Ordway shows is what Tolkien didn't like about The Lion, with the Witch, and the Wardrobe was he'd seen the early chapters, and the fawn is there. The fawn, if you've seen Disney's Hercules, remember when the Danny DeVito character, right? The fawn is first. Hercules first comes to the fawn. He's got himself stuck in a bush because he's leering after the nymphs, right? That there's a book on Mr. Tumnus's shelf that's like Nymphs in Their Ways or something. And that could have been what Tolkien was responding to, saying, Lewis, don't you get what you're putting into this children's story? The nymphs rape nymphs. The nymphs. The satyrs, like Mr. Tumnus, rape nymphs. They grab them, and the nymphs try turning into trees and things, just like in Hercules, kids movie. And so one of the things that he was worried about with the Narnia stories, he may not have, well, apparently he also thought Father Christmas and Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was a bit out of place. But he and Lewis were friends for years, and when, we know from the Notion Club papers that they do the toss-up, right? And Tolkien's going to write his time travel story, which he does and doesn't, right? We end up with the Númenórean stories eventually. And Lewis is going to write his space trilogy, and Lewis did write his space trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet, Pure Landra, and That Hideous Strength. And I have mentioned, I think, because I did remember this in detail from reading Out of the Silent Planet, that the main character is modeled on Tolkien, right? Ransom, the philologist, is the main character in Out of the Silent Planet. There are other elements that are probably drawn from Lewis and Tolkien's mutual reading. For example, they both read Voyage to Arcturus, and the main character in that travels in a sort of crystal bullet. Guess what? Ransom travels in. Right, so they're both drawing on story elements from other authors. But I'd forgotten this scene, right? So there's a variety of rational beings that Ransom encounters on Mars, Malacandra, and some of the Hrossa, but then there are also the Sorn, which are, well, sort of ghost-like, right? But they have other characteristics that I've forgotten about. Ransom is about to meet one of them, and this is the scene. Come in, small one, boomed the Sorn. Come in and let me look at you. Now that he stood face to face with the specter that had haunted him ever since he set foot on Malacandra, Ransom felt a surprising indifference. He had no idea what might be coming next, but he was determined to carry out his program. In the meantime, the warmth and more breathable air were heaven in themselves. He came in well past the fire and answered the Sorn. His own voice sounded to him a shrill treble. The Hrossa sent me to look for Aoyarsa, he said. The Sorn peered at him. You are not from this world, it said suddenly. No, replied Ransom, and sat down. He was too tired to explain. I think you are from Thule Condra, small one, said the Sorn. Why, said Ransom. You are small and thick, and that is how the animals ought to be made in a heavier world. You cannot come from Glundlandra, for it is so heavy that if any animals could live there, they would be flat like plates. I need to reread this. Even you, small one. When did I buy this? $1979. I must have had this from high school. Gotta reread it. Even you, small one, would break if you stood up on that world. I do not think you are from Paralandra, for it must be very hot. If any came from there, they would not live when they arrived here, so I conclude you are from Thulkandra. The world I came from is called Earth by those who live there, said Ransom. and it is much warmer than this. Before I came into your cave, I was nearly dead with cold and thin air. Okay, he doesn't sound like that, but how do I boom if I'm... He's booming. The Soren is booming. And he's questioning this little creature about who he is. Hint. The Soren made a sudden movement with one of its long forelimbs. Ransom stiffened, though he did not allow himself to retreat. But the creature might be going to grab him. In fact, its intentions were kindly. Stretching back into the cave, it took from the wall what looked like a cup. It's about to feed him. Then Ransom saw that it was attached to a length of flexible tube. The Soren put it into his hands. Smell on this, he said. The Rosa also need it when they pass this way. Ransom inhaled and was instantly refreshed. His painful shortness of breath was eased, and the tension of chest and temples was relaxed. The Soren in the lighted cavern, hitherto vague and dreamlike to his eyes, took on a new reality. I could say it's oxygen, right? And then they'd say, what's your name and how are you called? And we get a more detailed description of the Soren, that he's very, very tall, sort of spidery. He brings some things to it, food and drink from this cave. Talks about how they nourish their young, and then carries him. He's going to carry him to take him to see something. I forget what it is, but it's the carrying that matters. Okay. The proposal was unexpected and alarming. Oh, he said, you'll sit on my shoulder. The proposal was unexpected and alarming, but seeing that the Soren had already crouched down, Ransom felt obliged to climb onto the plume-like surface of its shoulder. He's a little creature going to ride on the giant's shoulder. Do you have the image? I mean, again, I can't believe that I didn't notice this, but it's a long time ago when I read it. Ransom felt obliged to climb on the plume-like surface of its shoulder to seat himself beside the long, pale face. Okay, the Soren is pale, but whatever. Casting his right arm as far as it would go round the huge neck, and to compose himself as well as he could for this precarious mode of travel. The giant rose cautiously to a standing position, and he found himself looking down on the landscape from a height of about 18 feet. Is all well, small one? It asked. Very well, Ransom answered, and the journey began. Its gait was perhaps the least human thing about it. It lifted its feet very high and set them down very gently. Ransom was reminded alternately of a cat stalking, a strutting barn door fowl, and a high-stepping carriage horse, but the movement was not really like that of any terrestrial animal. For the passenger, it was surprisingly comfortable. In a few minutes, he had lost all sense of what was dizzying or unnatural in that position. Instead, ludicrous and even tender associations came crowding into his mind. It was like riding an elephant at the zoo in boyhood, like riding on his father's back at a still earlier age. It was fun. They seemed to be doing between 6 and 7 miles an hour. The cold, though severe, was endurable, and thanks to the oxygen, he had little difficulty with its breathing. It was like riding an elephant at the zoo in boyhood, like riding on his father's back at a still earlier, like riding, if you were a hobbit, on the shoulders of an ant. Okay, so again, I learned this, Ordway pointed this out, and I was then, I'm not sure what to think, right? Of course, what? So I did a whole episode back. It's like, this is revising all of my previous episodes. I've done Galadriel is, modeled on the Virgin Mary. I've done the Ents from the famous footnote where he says, I don't know where I got them. It's this word, the great, work of giants from the Anglo-Saxon poem, The Ruin. I've done, what else have I used? I've done dragons, right? I did a whole episode of dragons, and I do think I've mentioned Andrew Lang before. But I hadn't remembered that ring story, or maybe I hadn't read it. It's sometimes hard to... All of the things I thought I knew are being undone and shown to me as having come from stories that I had not previously considered as either sources or influences, right? I think... Well, some of them I had considered sources and both sources and influences. Inglesant is the only one that's really oh my gosh, I've never even thought of that because I hadn't read it. But to find out that the Ents being, the most delightful and mysterious of Tolkien's creations, and modeled on, who knows, Sir Gawain and the giant and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, because the Soren are sort of pale and ghost-like, mainly. And at one point, Ransom says it's a new conception of the Sorns began to rise in his mind. The ideas of giant and ghost receded behind those of goblin and gawk. That it's the Sorn are colorless, white or cream in color. They seem to be covered in feathers. So the answer are obviously trees, and Tolkien develops them as trees, but as giants, and that there's that conversation about where do you come from, who are you, I don't know you in the lists. The Sorn goes through exactly the things that Treebeard does when he meets Merry and Pippin, and that he doesn't know what a hobbit is. So here's the Sorn talking to Ransom, saying, well, you couldn't come from that planet because you'd be flat as a plate. You couldn't come from that planet because it's too hot there. So you must come from I forgot what it's called. Thulkandra, right? I never liked this very much as a story, so Thulkandra, right? I've reread That's Hideous Strength more recently. I haven't reread Out of the Silent Planet or Pure Landra, and one, I realize I probably need to, but on the other, I don't like them. What am I going to do with the fact that characters that I love in Tolkien have leaf mold sources somewhere else? Well, so Ordway, as I said, she's doing this all to be honoring Tolkien, right? She's at no point in this exercise trying to show, look, this is, he's just getting it from everywhere else. And she insists over and over again that his modern reading is in fact only a small part of where he's picking and choosing elements from, right? And that, I say, there's plenty of scholarship out there that shows the way in which he does it with his medieval sources, like Beowulf or Sir Gawain and the Green Knight or the Pearl. I mean, I've been doing it. So what Ordway says she wants to do is, think about, creativity as this very complicated process, and saying, she says one particular thing I hope has been made evident in this study is that the process of inspiration is complex. Multiple influences often contribute to the same aspect of creativity. The example she gives there is the hobbits famously are snurgs, but they're also probably the rabbits from Beatrix Potter, and they're also Sinclair Lewis's Babbitt. All references that Tolkien, she's staying very, very close to what Tolkien actually mentions. References that Tolkien gave. So this hobbit, this absolutely original creation, no hobbits prior to Tolkien's naming them as such. He's Adam for hobbits. And yet you can see the story elements coming from these other things that he liked and read and drew upon, or disliked and thought he could improve on, like the Voyage to Arcturus, which, sort of a weird and wild story, and both he and Lewis are reading it and thinking, how would you deal with these problems of space travel better, and so forth. That we can be respectful of the problem of creativity, and yet in our very respect, it feels like you're taking it all apart, and again, looking for the bones rather than enjoying the soup. Well, what is the difference between understanding that Tolkien drew on Beowulf for his dragon and drew on Andrew Lang most likely for his ideas about rings? What is the difference between saying we found allusions to sources? It's delightful finding out that the Smaug dragon is actually the Beowulf dragon. Look, he rewrote it for us in the present. Is it simply the distance in time, that if you're using an old source, it's more venerable, and it's possibly obscure, and so the obscurity of the source that he puts into the story makes it more delightful to have it rewritten? Well, then the modern stories, if he's rewriting or improving on scientific fiction in the Notion Club papers, is that different from, say, John C. Wright's rewriting the elf stories and rewriting the Green Knight stories, and maybe rewriting the fairy tale stories? what is it that we want to accomplish by studying the sources and influences of our favorite authors, and what is it that we're afraid of? Well, so my poets and I were working on our Aurora Borealis, which I did a blog post on. It's called The Great Bear Tale, if you're curious about the project. And in plotting it, we're often, saying, okay, it's a Grail quest. The bears are going in search of the light. It's in Antarctica. The light's in Antarctica. And once you recognize that the structure of the story, the plot of the story says, the bears go in search of the light, what does it mean to find the light, find the source of the light? And that there is, because I'm a medievalist and I'm also a Christian, I'm going to be drawn to particular kinds of story structures. I'm going to want to have that quest feel of what it's like to come into the presence of the Grail that holds the holy blood, right? So what will I do? Well, we'll search for, objects and creatures and locations that might be appropriate for our telling, but the story keeps, Tom Shippey would call it calking onto other stories, that we find ourselves saying, okay, well, the bears go and visit this ice city down in Antarctica inhabited by penguins, and we've just rewritten the Wizard of Oz and the Emerald City because it's all green, because the Aurora Australis, like the Aurora Borealis, is green. So if the ice that the penguin city is all made of reflects green, wait, are we imitating the Wizard of Oz, or are we intensifying the reference to the Wizard of Oz? I mean, recognizing that I live in Chicago, and the World Fair that was held here in 1893, Tolkien was born in 1892, wasn't he? When was he born? I don't remember. It's 1892, 2 or 3, January 3rd. It's 1892, isn't it? The World's Fair that's held in 1893 here, famously, it's all white because, according to the Devil in the White City, that's a scam. Forgot to turn my phone off. Sorry. According to the Devil in the White City, the reason that the fair was white was because they were running out of time. They meant to paint it, and it ended up white. And Baum apparently visited the White City, and so the Emerald City in the Wizard of Oz, they have to put green glasses on, not because they'll be blinded by the green, but because it's in fact white, and the only way you can see it as green is if you put these green glasses on. That I am drawn to. I don't particularly like the Wizard of Oz as a story. It's not bad. It's not good. It's back when I was in high school, before I even ever visited Chicago, I tried reading the whole series. I'm not sure I finished. Because the Wizard of Oz says that there's a series of books which have goblins, which, they're goblins also in the George MacDonald stories, and maybe underground goblins that both Tolkien and Lewis got from reading George MacDonald. Now they're a trope that everybody believes goblins live underground because that's where George MacDonald put them, and then that's where, of course, Tolkien and Lewis have to put them. All of these things go into confecting the story, and you could say, okay, so you're just writing this derivative story, but that's kind of the way stories work, right? That we need them to reference each other, or they have to reference each other. There's only one story, right? And you could say absolutely all stories are rewriting the true story, and the true story is always going to be our, creation in the image and likeness of God, and that they're angels and demons and incarnation and art and historical references and magic objects like Solomon's ring in our stories. I say, obviously, what the delight in story is it's always, as Tolkien said, in the fairy stories, pointing us to the ultimate fairy story, which is the gospel, over and over and over again. So what should disturb us, I think, is not if Tolkien's stories are clearly drawing on his reading experience. I mean, I challenge you to take, to take Inglesant and Lord Dunsany and Andrew Lang and C.S. Lewis and Rider Haggard and all of the other authors that Tolkien read, both medieval and modern, and write the Lord of the Rings, right? That is, and I think that's what Ordway is trying to get at, right? This mystery of, the alchemy, or the cooking, right? Put all of this into the cauldron of story, and it's still going to be soup. It's still going to be something that is human flavored and nourishing, but it's going to be ultimately satisfying if, as Tolkien said in his On Fairy Stories, it points always to the primary story, the eucatastrophe of man's history, right? The birth of Christ. It should ground us. It's like, this is interesting. It's like, as fantastic as Tolkien's stories are, they should ground us in reality, because the reality that we're grounded in is the gospel. And the reality of the gospel is our Lord became incarnate and lived with us in story, in history. So the more that we find things attaching to other stories and other devices and other characters and other plots, the more we are drawn into that great web of stories that gives life meaning. Now, there's a coda to the story of the tower, which is quite fun, right? So we've said Tolkien saying that the tower had been confected of stone that was found, and his friends knocked it over and saying, "What a muddle is in?" But from the top of the tower, the man had been able to look out upon the sea. Another book that I've just acquired is John Garth's The Worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien, The Places That Inspired Middle-earth. And delightfully enough, there was a real tower. Probably. And saying that this is Tolkien to his audience in 1936, probably making a topical joke for his Oxford audience in particular, that his original allegory was simply a man found a mass of old stone in an unused patch and made of it a rock garden. But his friends coming perceived that the stones had once been part of a more ancient building, and they turned them upside down to look for hidden inscriptions. That was a 1933 lecture to his undergraduates. His 1936 lecture to the British Academy includes the version that we know with the tower, and apparently there was such a tower that had just been the subject of national controversy, being built outside Oxford by yet another of our local eccentrics, Lord Berners, musician, writer, artist, and famous eccentric whose friends included Salvador Dali. He had he proposed a folly on a hilltop in his estate west of Oxford, and the planning officials said they failed to see the object or benefit of this tower, to which he replied, "The great point of the tower is that it will be entirely useless." His neighbors complained, including one who lived some miles away, saying he wouldn't be able to see, it would spoil his view. The picture that Garth gives, it's actually quite lovely. But the Farringdon Folly, right? It was opened in 1935 with fireworks, society guests, and a full page in the Tatler. And there's a myth attached to it, apparently, according to Garth, that you can see Bristol Channel from it. Garth points out that Tolkien, certainly, because he's well read in the newspapers, right, can hardly have missed the furore over the tower. And knowing how Tolkien is inclined in things like, for example, Farmer Giles of Ham, to be making local jokes in, Farmer Giles of Ham, the tame dragon. He's the Farmer Giles of the tame dragon because he tamed the dragon that's on the Thames. It's all about, place names. That Tolkien, delighting in giving references, local references to real things in his stories. He always said he preferred history, right? So he is drawing the reality of our world into fairy, into this, the vision that he's trying to show us of the sea, because We, of course, inhabit a great fairy story, and we should expect, therefore, to find in the ingredients that Tolkien drew upon features of his own life and the reading that he enjoyed himself. I feel better now, rather than horrified about that passage from Inglesant. I'm curious about reading Inglesant, but I think I've convinced myself, and hopefully you, that it is a delight to find ourselves within the story. Thank you for joining me. To be continued.